In the history of the United States, foreign policy has often been shaped by doctrines.
Bold declarations that redefine how a nation sees the world, and how the world sees that nation. In 1823, President James Monroe warned European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It was a line drawn across oceans, an invisible border that would echo for centuries. But in the year 2026, that old doctrine has been reborn, with a new name, and a far more aggressive meaning. They call it the Monroe Doctrine. A modern reinterpretation of an old warning, but this time, backed not just by words, but by action. This is the story of how Donald Trump's return to power did not just reshape American politics, but altered the balance of power across the globe. And how a doctrine from the 19th century became the centerpiece of a 21st century geopolitical storm. When Donald Trump returned to the White House, the world expected disruption. They expected controversy. They expected bold statements. They expected unpredictability. What they did not expect was a complete redefinition of America's sphere of influence. Within weeks of taking office, Trump's administration began signaling a shift. Not toward diplomacy. Not toward multilateral agreements. But toward something older. Something more unilateral. More direct. A belief that the Western Hemisphere, North America, South America, Central America, was not just a region of interest, but a region of control. Behind closed doors, advisors began referencing the Monroe Doctrine, not as history, but as a blueprint. And soon, journalists began using a new term. Donroe. Donald Trump's Monroe Doctrine. For decades, China had been quietly investing across Latin America. Ports in Panama. Mines in Peru. Oil in Venezuela. Infrastructure in Brazil. What many saw as economic development, Washington began to see as strategic encirclement. To Trump, this wasn't trade. And infiltration demanded response. The message from Washington became clear. No rival power would be allowed to gain a foothold in America's backyard. Not economically. Not politically. And if necessary, not militarily. The first real test came unexpectedly. Venezuela. A nation rich in oil, politically unstable, and deeply tied to both Russia and China. For years, the U.S. had criticized its leadership. Sanctions had been placed. Diplomacy had failed. But under the Monroe Doctrine, patience was no longer policy. In a surprise overnight operation, U.S. Special Forces moved in. Within hours, the Venezuelan leadership was detained. No long speeches. No UN debates. No warnings. Just action. And the world woke up to a new reality. Latin American governments were stunned. Some quietly supported the move. Others condemned it publicly. But all understood one thing. The rules had changed. This was no longer the era of slow diplomacy. This was the return of hard power in the Western Hemisphere. China condemned the move. Russia called it imperialism. European leaders expressed deep concern. But Washington did not back down. Because this was not just about Venezuela. This was a demonstration. A signal. A warning. The message was now unmistakable. The Western Hemisphere was no longer a playground for global competition. It was a guarded zone. A monitored space. A region where Washington would no longer tolerate quiet expansion by rival powers. And suddenly, nations across Latin America began reassessing their alliances. Trade deals with China were reconsidered. Military cooperation with Russia was questioned. Infrastructure projects were paused. Because the risk had changed. What once looked like economic opportunity, now looked like geopolitical danger. For decades, China's strategy had been patient. Calculated. Silent. Billions of dollars flowed into ports, highways, energy grids, and mining operations across South America. These were not military bases. They were investments. But under the Monroe interpretation, these investments were no longer neutral. They were seen as strategic footholds. Potential leverage points. And in Washington's view, potential threats. This wasn't just about influence. This was about proximity. How close could a rival power get to the American mainland before it crossed an invisible line? According to the new doctrine, that line had already been crossed. And now, it was being pushed back. Diplomats from Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Colombia began visiting Washington more frequently. Not for celebration, but for clarification. They wanted to understand what this new doctrine really meant. Was it a warning? A policy? Or a promise of intervention? The answers they received were careful but firm. The United States would respect sovereignty. But it would not ignore strategic threats in its neighborhood. A sentence repeated again and again in private meetings. Carefully worded. Deliberately vague. Yet powerful enough to change decisions in presidential offices thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, Beijing was watching. Carefully. Silently. China had spent 2 decades building economic bridges across Latin America. And now those bridges were under political pressure. State media in China began criticizing what it called a revival of 19th-century imperial thinking. Analysts warned that Washington was turning back the clock. But for Trump's administration, this was not regression. It was restoration. A return to a time when America did not ask for permission to defend its sphere of influence. And while Latin America absorbed the shock of this shift, another audience was paying close attention. Moscow. Russia had long maintained quiet but meaningful ties with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Military advisors. Intelligence cooperation. Arms agreements. Nothing large enough to provoke direct conflict. But enough to establish presence. Enough to remind Washington that it was not alone in the region. Under previous administrations, these ties were tolerated. Monitored. Discussed in diplomatic channels. Under the Monroe Doctrine, tolerance was replaced with urgency. Presence was now unacceptable. And urgency meant action. U.S. naval patrols in the Caribbean increased. Surveillance flights became more frequent. Joint exercises with regional allies were expanded. Officially, these were routine security operations. Unofficially, they were signals. Signals that the era of passive observation was over. The Western Hemisphere was being actively secured. And as this new reality settled in, global analysts began asking a larger question. If the United States was this assertive in its own hemisphere, what would happen when rival powers responded in theirs? Would China tighten its grip in the South China Sea? Would Russia become more aggressive in Eastern Europe? Was the world entering an era where spheres of influence were no longer theoretical, but enforced? The balance of power was shifting. Not through speeches at the United Nations, but through movements on maps, naval routes, air patrol paths, economic corridors being redrawn under political pressure. And at the center of it all was a doctrine with a new name. Monroe. For Trump's supporters, this was strength. A long overdue correction to decades of what they saw as American hesitation. For critics, it was dangerous. A policy that risked escalating tensions with nuclear powers. But regardless of perspective, one thing was undeniable. The doctrine was working. Because it was being noticed. Presidents were adjusting policies. Investors were reconsidering projects. Military planners were redrawing strategies. And the Western Hemisphere was no longer quiet. It had become the focal point of a global chessboard, where every move was being watched, and every response was being calculated. This was no longer just foreign policy. This was geopolitical repositioning. And it was happening faster than anyone expected. Because unlike traditional doctrines that evolve slowly through diplomacy, this one was unfolding through action. Decisive. Visible. Unapologetic. And the world was beginning to understand that this was not a temporary phase. This was a new operating principle. A new way the United States intended to interact with its surroundings. Not as a distant observer, but as an active guardian of its sphere. And as the months passed, the question was no longer whether this doctrine existed. The question was how far it would go. How many lines would be redrawn? How many relationships would be reshaped? And how many global powers would feel compelled to respond? Because history had shown one thing clearly. When great powers begin defining spheres of control, collision is rarely far behind. The United States had made its intentions clear. The Donroe Doctrine was no longer theory, it was action. Across the Americas, governments were recalibrating. Alliances were reconsidered. Economic deals were delayed. Military cooperation was quietly paused. Every move was being measured against the new reality, Washington's renewed dominance in its hemisphere. In Brazil, diplomats watched closely. In Colombia, leaders held emergency meetings. Even in Mexico, where trade and security ties were deep, whispers of caution grew louder. The message was unmistakable: the United States was asserting its sphere of influence, and caution would no longer be tolerated. Meanwhile, China and Russia observed silently. Investments and infrastructure projects that once seemed benign were now seen as strategic footholds. What had been subtle influence was now interpreted as direct challenge. And Washington's response was deliberate and visible. Naval patrols in the Caribbean increased, military exercises were expanded, and intelligence operations intensified. This was a doctrine of presence. A doctrine of surveillance. A doctrine that sent a clear message: the Western Hemisphere would be monitored and defended. For ordinary citizens, the changes were barely visible. But in the corridors of power, the implications were profound. Every decision, every agreement, and every partnership now carried the weight of geopolitical calculation. It was a new era of influence. One where the United States was not merely a participant in hemispheric affairs, but a guardian of its borders and interests. And as the months passed, global analysts began to ask, how far would this doctrine extend? Would it remain confined to the Americas, or could its principles reshape relationships across the world? The answer, for now, remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: the Donroe Doctrine had transformed Washington from an observer into a decisive actor, and the ripples of that transformation were only beginning to be felt. The global response to the Donroe Doctrine had begun to take shape. As Washington asserted its renewed influence in the Americas, rival powers were quietly strategizing. China and Russia, long accustomed to subtle influence, now faced a direct challenge. Analysts in Beijing and Moscow watched the movements in the Western Hemisphere closely, assessing each naval patrol, each diplomatic visit, and every economic maneuver. The message from Washington was unmistakable: the United States would actively protect its interests, and hesitation would no longer be tolerated. In the corridors of power across Latin America, leaders felt the pressure. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, even countries that had maintained neutral stances, were reconsidering their alignments. Every agreement, every investment, and every military cooperation now carried new weight. Naval exercises in the Caribbean were expanded. Surveillance flights became routine. Intelligence operations intensified. This was more than a demonstration of force, it was a statement of presence. The United States was asserting a doctrine that demanded attention. Behind the scenes, global analysts debated the potential consequences. Would this doctrine provoke confrontation? Could China and Russia respond without escalating tensions? The answers remained uncertain, but the implications were clear: the hemisphere had entered a new era of strategic calculation. For Trump's administration, this was a reaffirmation of American resolve. The Donroe Doctrine was not a temporary measure or a symbolic gesture. It was an active, ongoing strategy. And its effects were already reshaping relationships, policies, and decisions across the region. Ordinary citizens saw little of this change, but in the halls of governments, it was unmistakable. The balance of influence had shifted. Washington was no longer a distant observer, it was a decisive actor, and every action sent ripples across the Americas. As the months unfolded, one question lingered: how far would the Donroe Doctrine reach? Would its principles extend beyond the hemisphere? Could the methods employed here serve as a blueprint for influence on a global scale? Only time would reveal the full impact. But one thing was certain: the doctrine had transformed the United States' role from passive participant to assertive guardian of its sphere, and the world was taking notice. As the Donroe Doctrine continued to unfold, the world began to adapt. Nations across the Americas, once operating with relative independence, now moved cautiously, fully aware of Washington's renewed assertiveness. Diplomatic channels were abuzz with discussions. Agreements were reviewed. Trade deals reconsidered. Every decision carried the shadow of a doctrine that prioritized presence over negotiation. The United States had shifted from being an observer to a proactive guardian of its hemisphere. China and Russia, while measured in their responses, began adjusting their strategies. Investments that were once welcomed quietly faced new scrutiny. Military advisors and intelligence analysts debated contingencies. Every move was calculated to avoid direct confrontation while still protecting interests. In Washington, the administration monitored these reactions closely. Every naval patrol, every diplomatic visit, every economic signal was analyzed. The doctrine was not merely about action, it was about perception. A demonstration that influence, if not respected, would be challenged. Across Latin America, the impact was tangible. Governments were navigating a new reality, balancing external pressures with internal priorities. Economies were adjusting. Military strategies were revised. Political alliances shifted subtly but significantly. For the United States, the message had been clear: hemispheric stability was intertwined with American presence. The Donroe Doctrine had become a guiding principle, not temporary, not symbolic, but active and ongoing. Analysts around the world speculated about the next steps. Could the doctrine serve as a model for influence beyond the Americas? Would Washington's assertive approach encourage similar strategies in other regions? While uncertainties remained, the significance was undeniable. And yet, amid strategy and planning, the human element persisted. Decisions made in high towers of power impacted lives across continents. Policies, maneuvers, and doctrines were not abstract, they touched economies, communities, and everyday citizens. As the hemisphere adjusted, one reality stood clear: the Donroe Doctrine had transformed the global landscape. It had shifted power, influenced alliances, and demanded attention from every corner of the world. Donald Trump's vision, controversial to many and praised by some, had left an indelible mark. The United States was no longer a silent participant. It was a decisive actor, and the consequences, both intended and unforeseen, would resonate for years to come. In the end, history would remember this period not merely as a political chapter, but as a time when doctrine met action, and the world witnessed the assertion of American influence like never before. The Donroe Doctrine was no longer just a name. It had become a defining moment in global politics, shaping strategies, challenging rivals, and rewriting the rules of engagement in the Western Hemisphere.